Welcome to Unforbidden Truth. I'm Andrew. Today I'll be speaking with retired special agent Steve Giannangelo. Steve was a criminal investigator for the state of Illinois and also worked with certain FBI task forces throughout his career. He's also a published author. He's working on his fourth book titled Irresistible Impulses Defending the Insanity of Serial Murder. Here's my interview with Steve Giannangelo.
My name is Steve Giannangelo. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts. My career and education and all of that whole history has kind of a windy road to it. But I grew up there in the 60s and 70s and was your typical kid that loved horror movies and all that. But around the mid 60s, my mom started freaking me out because she was worried about this guy named Albert DeSalvo that had become the terror of Boston, and we didn't know what a serial killer or anything else was like that. So suddenly I figured out what you should really be afraid of. It kind of stuck in my head. I moved to the Midwest a while later. Well, actually, I went to college in the Boston area. Went to Boston State and Framingham State and studied psychology. But then I moved to the Midwest in an attempt to try to play pro hockey, which is an entirely different conversation. But after that ended, I went back to grad school and decided that I was going to take clinical psychology. Took that for a while with sort of an emphasis on abnormal psych, and this was a time when forensic psychology and serial killers and all that wasn't the topic that it is right now, but it was still kind of coming out there. But after seeing interviews with Kenny Bianchi when he was playing those psychology games and everything else, it caught me. It kind of hooked me in. So I started doing that. So I changed to forensic psychology and got a master's degree in forensic psychology. Around the same time, a little while later, I decided to go into law enforcement. Got a job as a criminal investigator with the state of Illinois. With revenue, did all sorts of financial crime and different types of cases there. Get involved in quite a bit of cases that had to do with anti-government individuals. They weren't using the expression sovereign citizen back then, but that's kind of what we were dealing with. So that was kind of an interesting thing that would come up later on in my career. But meanwhile, my master's thesis got published as a textbook, and it was received pretty well. And my teacher from my very first serial murder class that I took in 1992 was an international expert named Steve Egger. And people were pretty thrilled to get to sit in a class with Steve Egger. And long story short here, the Dahmer trial was going on when I was in his class. And I also had a contact with the Milwaukee PD, and I managed to get a copy of his confession and of some of his Polaroids that he took. Now, a lot of that stuff is out there now that you can buy, but in 1992, that was like beyond belief that you had that in your possession. So I went to my teacher, would you be interested in the confession of this guy they just picked up in Milwaukee, or that they're trying in Milwaukee? And he just about fell out of his chair. And ever since then, we became very close, and we became colleagues and worked together a lot. So I started doing classes for him. He took ill after a while, and he actually asked me to take over his serial murder class at University of Illinois. And I have been teaching that class and other forensic psychology classes ever since. It's been about 25 years. So that's my long story as far as teaching for U of I. And for when I started out as a criminal investigator, I retired after 20 plus years, and that's where we are.
That's awesome. That's quite the resume.
It was a longer story than I wanted it to be, but there it goes.
Right, right. So you partially answered one of my questions, which was working as a criminal investigator for the state of Illinois. Did you ever handle any type of high profile cases? I know you didn't really work like any murder cases. You just said like financial crimes and stuff related to the state and government workers.
Right. Not government workers. It was regular citizens who were breaking crimes. I mean, breaking laws and all that, different types of crimes like that. I ended up doing work with state police on a lot of their crimes as well. And I don't know that they were high profile crimes. That I certainly learned a lot testifying in court and all that with those kind of cases. But uh, both those kind of cases and the cases that I work with FBI, I can talk about them in a general aspect, but I can't really get into particulars as far as cases.
Right. Okay. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, so and feel free to tell me to, not ask any questions if I overstep the line. I know you said you couldn't talk about cases specifically, but I'm
Mhm.
curious, at one point in time you worked with the FBI on a joint terrorism task force. Can you talk about what that entailed as far as like job details, not necessarily cases, but are you able to talk about like what actually went into your work doing that?
Sure, I can talk about that. I mean, I worked over there as a task force agent for a couple of years, and ended up working in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And what we ended up doing is we worked terrorism cases that were categorized by the FBI as either IT or DT, which is international terror or domestic terror. Both terrorism is terrorism, really, any way you look at it. But obviously the international cases had some sort of a nexus or a beginning of, were initiated outside the borders of the United States. Domestic terror is kind of a different animal altogether. You're usually dealing with anti-government individuals, sovereign citizens, far left or far right extremists, usually have some kind of a social agenda, that kind of thing. And those cases were fascinating. I have to say my time with FBI it was never a dull moment. It was always super interesting.
So from your point of view, what does terrorism mean? I know that terrorism can necessarily not be like murder, but it could be like terrorist, acts or terrorist threats, like threatening somebody but not necessarily carrying something out. And your point of view, what does terrorism mean to you?
Um, uh, Terrorism has a number of different definitions depending on your application, obviously. But really, the bottom line is it's a criminal act that is meant to either intimidate or to coerce a person or a group of people. That's kind of a general way to describe it. But you can say that terrorists act in a manner just because they hate people and they just want to quote unquote terrorize them, or you can talk about organized terror where you're trying to actually influence a group of individuals to act in a certain manner, or maybe get a government to make a certain decision on or off, some other issue.
So would you say that most, if not all, hate crimes would be an act of terrorism? Like targeting
I
people
would
specifically
call,
for their race or religion or whatever?
yeah, I think that's fair. I think I would call most, essentially all hate crimes to be terrorism. I mean, at some level, they don't generally uh, charge terrorism in those kind of cases, because terrorism cases are very difficult to charge and they have to be very specific as far as the elements and all that when you're going into prosecution. And I think it's much easier to just prove the act, the uh, violence or the criminal behavior, that sort of stuff. Thing is with terrorism that people don't understand is that there's so many different offshoots of other crimes that are related to terrorism that you don't see, because a lot of terror funding is propped up by other criminal activity, well, whether it's cigarette smuggling or whether it's robbery or financial crimes, that sort of thing. So the tentacles of crime fit in with terrorism that you don't see quite often. And sometimes in some terror cases, depending on the penalties, it's easier to try to prosecute other crimes that are related as opposed to an actual terror act itself. Depends, violence is different, of course.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That's understandable.
Yeah.
So what can we as citizens or as a country do to stop or prevent terrorism from happening? Is that even possible?
Um, it's possible. I think people would be shocked if they knew how effective this country has been in shielding us from terror since 9/11. I managed to get up close and personal and see how these people work, and they're really good at it. So better, that's for sure. From a security standpoint, as far as a citizen's concerned, I mean, you don't want people to be looking over other people's shoulders or anything like that, but I think people have to be willing to report things that they know, and I believe that there's situations where somebody hears somebody say something or they know they're up to something and they just eat it because it's family members or it's an ethnicity that they're sympathetic towards or whatever the reason happens to be. But I think, when terror touches you, you think differently about those sort of things. And I think they should be prepared to act if they know things.
So it's funny. I used to talk to Mahmoud Abu Halima, Ayad Ismail, and I'm blanking on the third guy's name, but three out of the five 93 World Trade Center bombers I used to speak to, and two of them claimed to be innocent. The other one said that he was like a freedom fighter and he was a political prisoner, and
Mm-hmm.
they did these things to avenge what was going on in their country, which I thought was kind of fascinating. When I told him, I'm like, well, you're considered a terrorist, and he's like, I'm not a terrorist. The United States of America is a terrorist for going over there and doing to our people what they've been doing for hundreds of years. Blah 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 blah. And I think it's
Right.
fascinating to get their side of the story when it comes to terrorism. But obviously, no matter how you look at it, they are terrorists, and they commit terrorist acts. I mean, attacking
Yeah.
some federal buildings or state buildings for that matter with planes or guns or whatever in the name of Allah or whatever it may be is terrorism in my mind.
Sure. I don't want to, their rhetoric or reasoning or whatever word you want to use to describe it, it's predictable, certainly. And a lot of them have been brought in situations where I might be angry too, certainly. I mean, there are things that have happened to their families and things that have gone on in their countries. I think it's a little misguided when you start pointing towards this country or this group and start accepting things like collateral damage. When I watch 9/11 and I see a guy who went to work that day and just trying to make a living for his family, and he had to jump out of one of those windows because it was on fire, and somebody thought that they were proving a point. I don't want to hear what their point is. I really don't.
Right, right. Yeah, that's totally understandable because at that point it's just bullshit, really. I mean, they're just trying to make excuses for killing innocent people, really.
Sure, but then again, you had people like that read the shoe bomber not long after that. This is somebody that went to a terror camp and didn't think they were serious enough for him. This is somebody who goes, I'll take care of it myself. So I mean, some of them believe their goals, that's for sure, and we can't discount that.
Right, right. So you're an expert in serial murder, and the million-dollar question which everybody has is what drives them one day to wake up and kill multiple people? Do you have an answer for that or a generalized answer for that?
I might have a long answer for that. I the more that I study serial murder, and I mentioned my teacher, Steve Egger, and he always used to say, you know what, the longer I study this, the less I realize I know. And I always believed that was true. I think the biggest thing that I would point out when you ask a question like you have is that when I was interviewing a serial killer for my second book, I had a chapter on an entire time that I spent with him, and kind of getting in his head a little bit. And the one thing he wanted to impart to me was that he was annoyed with experts coming in there and assuming they knew the answers to the questions before he gave them. And he was also annoyed with the fact that they always were trying to pigeonhole them into this formula or maybe fit a theory that they had. The fact is, if you look at serial killers, each one of their situation is different. I mean, they're a tapestry all their own. They're their own piece of art. There's a lot of different things that come into play. You could have a mental illness that causes them to be in a situation where it's impossible for them to uh, consider empathy or feel empathy, or they might have an issue with a certain sexuality that could cause them to commit, pattern crimes that are unacceptable in our world. Or they could have had a genetic disorder that's something entirely different that could affect their behavior. Or maybe later on you could talk about somebody who had an experience or a trauma that could have affected them that have put them in another track. or maybe even a certain anger or whatever. The point that I'm getting at is when people start wanting to give you a formula for the serial killer, there's way too many ingredients involved. And the key is to sit down and understand what this serial killer is about, what his life story is, what his history is about, and what made him tick.
So, can you break down the differences and similarities between spree killers, mass murderers, and serial killers?
Sure. Really, to be oversimplified, the FBI came up with a definition for serial killers. For a serial murderer back in 2005, they had a big symposium that invited a lot of experts together to try to kind of break this down and make it easier for people that are working law enforcement or people that are actually studying this, so we could kind of be working on the same page. Because honestly, especially back then in the early 2000s, if you talk to five authors, they had five different examples of what serial murder was. So the FBI said at that point in time that serial murder was somebody who kills more than two over time. And they made it that simple. So they tried not to have it be too qualified or anything. And then everything kind of flows from that. Now, some people will tell you two's not enough. Some will say three, some will say they can argue about this all day long. But the point is, you're talking about somebody who kills at a repeated level, and that it's not all in one event, that it's different events, which separates it from the mass murderer. And the mass murderer kills 3, 4 more in a single event. There could be secondary events like secondary explosions or whatnot. But the idea is that it's all one act, it's all one thing. Two very different criminals. I would never say that trying to make these differences between them is a waste of time, because if you're in law enforcement, if you're trying to find somebody, if you're looking at them psychologically, they're very different cats. These are different people. A predatory patient serial killer is far different than somebody who's probably exhibiting overt signs of mental illness trying to blow up a building. As far as spree killers, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a great example of how researchers have changed their minds over the years. I know my teacher and I used to sit and argue about whether Andrew Cunanan was a serial killer or a spree killer. It was a perfect argument, because you could argue either side, and you can do that all day. And we would do that all day for sure. The point is, he's both, okay? If you really look at what a spree killer is, it's somebody that's killing repeatedly, but in a more compact series of kills, as opposed to long-term over years, that sort of thing. And it's usually an extension of the same emotional break. It usually has a start, a point where they start killing, and then the spree continues until it naturally burns itself out, whether they kill themselves, whether they get caught, however it happens to work out. But the fact is that those acts, say, using the example of Cunanan, he's also a serial killer. So all those arguments that we had, that is he a spree killer or is he a serial killer? A spree killer is a serial killer, as far as I'm concerned, and most researchers would agree with.
On the topic of spree killers, I talked to a spree killer. I don't know if you've heard of him. His name is Jonathan Cruz, the Purge killer. They claim that he copied the Purge movies, and
Oh
he
yeah,
killed 3 people over a course of like a 72-hour period. He actually wants to
okay.
argue with an expert that he's not a spree killer and he's an actual serial killer, and this happened over the course of like 3 days. So I don't know if you'd be interested in that, but he wants to find an expert to argue with, because he feels that he's been classified wrong, which I think is kind of funny.
What's his argument?
That he killed over the course of 3 days, and he didn't kill all at one time. And I keep telling him, like, if you killed them all at one time, you'd be a mass murderer, not a spree killer. And if you were a serial killer, you'd have a cooling off period. And he's like, no, I don't think so. Plus, I'm a gang member, and I don't think I should be classified as a spree killer. And I'm like, well, there might be an argument there, there might not. I don't know.
I would address both of those things. The FBI that looked at both of them, the concept of a cooling off period was really popular in the 70s and 80s, and the FBI's kind of walked away from the concept of a cooling off period. They're trying not to use that because they feel that the label of a cooling off period means that there is an actual emotional change. And it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes what we're calling a cooling off period is Andrea Chikatilo not committing crimes because they're looking for them. Okay, so there's a number of different reasons why serial killers stop or pause. That thing that we're calling a cooling off period does exist, but I know the FBI is either trying to use another label or walk away from it altogether. So, and as far as the gang members that you talked about, that's another thing that researchers have changed their minds about. I never would have considered a gang member to be a serial killer at one point in time. There's also, I would never have considered somebody that killed for money to be a serial killer as well back in the 70s and 80s. That's how we felt about that thing. Researchers have changed their minds about that. They've looked at what is the FBI definition. It's somebody who kills X number of people over time. So they have actually included gang members, and they have actually included people that are using reasons for killing that I wouldn't have considered before. So I mean, it's yet another example of how we have to evolve in our study of this.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. I've never considered gang members to be serial killers, but that makes total sense.
Yeah, and there are legitimate arguments. I mean, if you want to look at the prototypical serial killer, I mean, you have to look at the lust type, sexually motivated killer. I mean, it's your classic serial killer. I think most people would agree with that. But I just think that the way the FBI is looking at it, and I'm not pretending the FBI has the answers to everything. It's just an easy reference point. That they have a very general term for a serial killer, and then we break it down from there. I think that's the best way to do it.
Right, right. So, you've written a handful of books. Can you tell me about those, what they're all about, and where people can find them?
Sure, absolutely. My first book was called The Psychopathology of Serial Murder, a Theory of Violence. I mentioned earlier that it's based on my master's thesis, and it was the people on my master's committee said, we need to get this published. I'm like, okay, let's do that. So it was published as a textbook in 1996. FBI had it on their shelves at Quantico not long after, and it's been used as a textbook quite a bit. So I've been happy with that. And if you look at when it was published in '96, serial murder wasn't really being looked at as primarily a psychological event. It was more studied more from a sociological basis, a criminology basis. So that whole psychological theory was kind of a departure. So it was kind of important to me back then. In 2012, I sort of wrote that book over. I completely went back like X number of years later, 14 years or whatever it was later, and I tried to update everything, tried to bring it into where we were in 2012. I included that chapter that I mentioned before of the interviews that I did on that killer that I met on death row, and and that was a completely new factor to that book that made it important. So that book was it's called Real Life Monsters: The Psychological Examination of the Serial Murderer. That's been pretty successful too. It's been out for a while, I guess. I can't believe it's been that long, but I still saw a lot of those for some reason. A couple of years ago, in 2022, I reached a point where I was talking to different people who had read my previous two books, and they said, "Write another book. We like to read this stuff." So it made sense to me. So I tried to kind of go in a completely different direction, and I wrote a book that I considered to be sort of a serial killer pleasure reader. It just had a lot of different case studies that you've either heard of or maybe you never heard of at all, and some academic stuff that was interesting, but I didn't bog it down in academics because I wanted to be lighter murder reading. And I had a lot of different items in there that I found to be interesting. And there's a chapter on murderabilia, female killers, all sorts of stuff. Plus, I talked a lot about the concept of actually teaching the subject of serial murder and interviewing serial killers. And that book was, it's titled Monsters in the Mirror, Reflections on the Study of Serial Murder. That came out in 2022. And brings me to today, to the book that I'm finishing up now. That's my project that I'm finishing these days.
So can all those books be found on Amazon today, including the textbook?
Yes, you can get them all on Amazon. Absolutely. Look it up on my name. It's the longest Italian name on there, so it's easy enough to find. And but yeah, you can get all three of those on Amazon right now.
Awesome, awesome. So, before we conclude this interview, is there anything that you'd like to talk about or plug?
Yeah, I should plug the new book. It's about the insanity defense. It's something that I found to be fascinating as I've taught about it over the last 25 years. There have been articles and books on insanity defense, but I found them to be dry and not exactly the kind of thing that I was interested in, because I wanted to look specifically at the use of the insanity defense by the serial murderer. Because I think the insanity defense and the serial killer are a match made in hell. I said that in the book, and I believe that that's the case. I think that they go together perfectly. And so there's a few chapters on different aspects of the insanity defense that aren't related to serial murder, just sort of to set that up. But then I have case studies with some of the more famous cases: Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and the appeal of Ted Bundy on his competency appeal. They were all either in a formal insanity defense cases or were related to that. I've also got a chapter where I interviewed Richard Rappaport, who was the lead psychiatrist in the Gacy case and the expert witness, and also with Dr. Fred Berlin, who was one of the expert witness psychiatrists for Jeffrey Dahmer. So I think it's interesting as hell, and I love people to read it. I'm getting pretty close to finishing it up. Should be out in the spring. So that will also be on Amazon. The name of that is Irresistible Impulses. I should tell you that.
Okay, okay. Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm hoping we can meet at one of these live events in the near future.
That would be great. I'm all for it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
You too. That was my interview with Steve Giannangelo. For extra content, ad-free episodes, and more, head on over to patreon.com/unforbidden truth. Thank you for listening. Catch you in the next one.
Unforbidden truth.